My name is Eldridge Theodore Bentley Wilson. I was born January the 15th, 1927.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
I was 16 years old when I tried to join the Navy, but they would not accept my birth certificate because, or I beg your pardon, my baptismal certificate, because they thought it had looked altered, which it was. I altered it because it was white and my birth certificate was blue. So I couldn't get in the Navy. The Marine Corps had a line about 3 blocks long, and I thought, well, maybe I'll have a better chance if I go to Cleveland and join the Coast Guard, because I had an uncle in the Coast Guard and I admired him, and I know that he was at sea at that time in the Atlantic. So I went to Cleveland, unbeknownst to my family. I was accepted in Cleveland with my blue certificate, which I really altered in a better fashion than the baptismal certificate. So the Coast Guard accepted me. My basic training was done in Sheepshead Bay, New York. I was trained to be a seaman in the United States Navy. My first ship was the USS Pert. We did anti-submarine and convoy patrol in the North Atlantic. Well, it was exciting. It was, I was among real seamen. These guys that had been on the Corvette had been on prior to the war, shepherding ships out to where the Canadian Navy could take over and try to get these ships to England. So I joined this crew as a recruit. They accepted me, and I learned from them the basic needs to be a seaman. To be a real seaman. Watch standing was a requisite, good eyesight was a requisite, and obedience to order was a requisite, which I complied with. On the USS Pert, I was a wheelsman at times. I was a lookout for most parts, and I was also attached to the watch that we stood 2 hours on, 2 hours off, and we were manning the ash cans that blew up submarines, the depth charges. I was part of that crew, and we would be on deck in the North Atlantic in the wintertime, so we could only be out on that deck 2 hours. We were attached to safety lines because the ship was so low in the sea that we were awash quite a bit of the time. So then we would come in and sit in an area they called the Fiddly, which was above the fire rooms, because this was a steam reciprocating engine that drove this ship, and we sat in this heat above the fire room for 2 hours. You could nod off if you could, which we did frequently, but we were always up for our next watch. I was on the USS Pert for 60 days. Well, we went to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for what they called an overhaul, which took the crew off of the ship. We were put in barracks, and then there was a cleanup crew in Guantanamo Bay that steam cleaned the interior of the ship because of the fact we could not do any housekeeping at sea. And as the way the ship tossed and rolled and what have you, whatever you put on the table went on the deck. So the steam cleaning was necessary. While in Guantanamo Bay, I was advised that there was, if you were a seaman first class, which I was at the time, I went from seaman second to seaman first in that 60 days, that there was a request for volunteers to go to the Southwest Pacific to join the 7th Amphibious Fleet, which was manned basically by Coast Guardsmen, although we were part of the Navy at the time. So I volunteered, and I was sent to the South Pacific. When I got to the South Pacific, I was assigned to the USS Glendale. And I served on the Glendale until the Glendale no longer existed in our military. The Glendale was listed as a patrol gunboat, to my knowledge. Gunboats work with the amphibious landings that were taking place under MacArthur's command. I boarded the Glendale in Gamadodo, New Guinea. The Glendale, as far as I can remember, was over 200 feet, I think. And I don't know, about 80 feet wide, I guess. I don't know what the draft was. We were sonar equipped, and we were also equipped with the 5-inch guns, the 40s, 20s, 50s, the whole schmear. We were a gunship. The invasions that I remember was around New Guinea and some small islands in the Solomons. And also we made a trip to the Philippine Islands, to Leyte Gulf. In Leyte Gulf, when we left there, we went back to Milne Bay, New Guinea. Between Milne Bay and Humboldt Bay, this is where my group, which was the 32nd Squadron, there was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was 8 ships assigned to that particular squadron. They were all gunboats, and we alternated between Milne Bay and Humboldt Bay, depending on how the 7th was going to be deployed on the next trip. We didn't know, of course. They were mostly islands that had radio stations, Japanese radio stations on them, and where they were building airfields and what have you. So there were miscellaneous, let's say. No big naval, Japanese naval bases at that particular time. Had been invaded by the Marines that were attached to the 7th Fleet. I don't remember what divisions they were, 3rd and 7th or something. And we were assigned to patrol the Lady Gulf in case if there had been Japanese troops sent to that area, we were there to keep them from harming our troops. The USS Glendale was turned over to the Russians in Cold Bay, Alaska. That's when I was removed from the ship and sent to the U.S. Naval Air Station on Kodiak Island, Alaska. Yes, I was involved in the project of training the Soviet Navy to use our equipment. My job was generally small boat handling, which was LCVPs, LCIs, what have you. In nighttime maneuvering and also heavy sea maneuvering. We taught the Russians to handle the boat. So we were basically dealing with Russians. I left the service, I believe it was 1945. I bounced around, drank a lot of beer, and then rejoined the Coast Guard. At that particular time, the Cold War was pretty much in effect, and the border between the United States and Canada was kind of a soft border. So basically that was our patrol station, was off of Belle Isle, Michigan. There was a large Coast Guard contingency there. There was a big contingency in Cleveland and also Chicago. So it was more or less border patrol, but not classified as such. It was classified basically rescue, service and rescue. I went to Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. In Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, I was assigned to the Sherwood Point Lighthouse, where they were converting it to automation. And I was there for 2 years. I was participating in the care and maintenance of the establishment, and also there was another lighthouse that was out in the middle of Green Bay. It was radio operated to turn the foghorn on, and also the light at this lighthouse out in the middle of Green Bay, Peshtigo Reef Lighthouse and Sherwood Point were actually one entity, but it was all going into automation. They were going to remove all the attendants but one. After I got out of the military, I used the GI Bill of Rights to go to school, and then I got an apprenticeship in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and that was my life until I retired. Met my wife in 1948, Gloria Williams. I had 4 children. The oldest was Pamela, the second oldest was Richard, the third oldest was Karen, and then there was the baby, after 10 years, called Patricia. We lived, well, in the beginning, my wife and I and one child. We had Pamela prior to my going to Sturgeon Bay. And then after coming back from Sturgeon Bay, we lived in a complex in a housing project in Hamtramck, and then I bought a house on Nagel in Roseville, Michigan. And then I bought another house later on in Clinton Township, Michigan. And we lived there until my retirement.